So yes, I've entitled my talk Sunset over Arcadia, the decline of the Baroque musette. You know, when Erin and Robert asked me to speak at this symposium around Laborde's Choix de Chansons, the date of publication, 1773, really stood out to me and got me thinking about what a significant turning point the 1760s and 1770s were for this instrument here, which I happen to play, the musette, which went from, you know, absolute ubiquity in French musical and artistic life. How do I move that on? Am I doing the wrong thing?
Use the mouse.
Use the mouse?
Yeah, it's irritating. You just bring it down.
Bring it down there, yep. And now what? I can't use the pointies. Thanks, Erin.
So you just
okay.
Press the left button.
Lovely, thank you. So yeah, the musette went from absolute ubiquity in French musical and artistic culture, and it even appears in 4 different occasions here on in the Choix de Chansons, which, by the way, I found courtesy of Pia's wonderful cloud of keywords, and was able to search for bagpipe, and up they popped in about 2 minutes, which was great. So you can see here the musette depicted. I know I'm supposed to use my mouse, aren't I? The musette depicted in a couple of the images, in 3 of the images, in fact, and also mentioned explicitly here in one of the songs. So, but Laborde himself in 1780 pronounced the musette dead. So just 7 years after this publication, in which he depicted it thrice and put it in a song once, he pronounced the instrument dead just 7 years later. And that in turn got me thinking about more broadly how the musette's rise and fall illustrates this major tipping point in French music and society. I was reminded of the painter Carmontel's portrait of this woman, Mrs. Blizet, playing the musette with her husband, Mr. Blizet, on the left-hand side there, which was painted just 8 years before the Choix de Chansons were published. So this is from 1765. And in the same series, Carmontel famously depicts the Mozart family, including a 7-year-old Amadeus performing before the French court. And that's him on the left there, obviously, with his father and sister, who didn't write a note of anything. And on the right-hand side here, this gentleman, Jean-Philippe Rameau, the opera composer, the Baroque composer and theorist. And you know, it just got me thinking about how music history was compressed at this time. Mozart, young Mozart, he's 7 years old there, but 11 years later, 1 year after the Choix de Chansons were published, he wrote his first concerto for a woodwind instrument, which was the bassoon, in a fully mature classical style. And also we see here, of course, Rameau, who was, you know, still composed. Well, he composed his last opera in the same year that Mozart is depicted there, 1763. So it's just interesting to think how compressed musical culture became at this time. I was reminded that for one brief moment in musical history, it was possible to hear newfangled clarinets and bagpipes in an orchestra at the same time. So here we've got some scores by Rameau, and if you look at Laborde, which was from 1763, up the top here, you can see that in the very beginning of the overture, he asks for clarinets. Here's Zoroastre, which is from 1749, and here he asked for musettes, not one musette, but multiple musettes in his orchestra. And down here, an aria from, or an choir from Les Indes Galantes from 1735. And again, you can see that not only is where's my mouse gone? Not only is the text about musettes, resound, resound in this laughing grove, but it has a musette or obligato for musettes there. And then look what happens down here. The second musettes come in, not the second musette singular, but at least 2. So the expectation here is that Rameau had 4 bagpipes in his orchestra, at least. Baroque and classical musical languages, French and Italian national styles really jostled with one another in the 2 decades leading up to the French Revolution. And it was into this hothouse that the Choix de Chansons was born. and in the same musical hothouse that the poor old musette withered and died. Where do I move to my next slide? So what is the musette? Well, the musette is the smallest and poshest member of the bagpipe family, which is a very large pan-European family of instruments. With the chanter there, the main melody playing pipe, the chanter measuring at around 20 centimetres, it's less than half the length of the chanter of a Scottish Highland pipe you see on the left that you're all familiar with, or the Irish Ulen pipes on the right-hand side there. And in fact, the chanter of the Baroque musette is even smaller than, that's a Baroque piccolo for comparison. So smaller than a little tiny recorder that's primary school students play, and smaller than the piccolo, really a tiny little instrument. The clearest identifying feature of the Baroque musette is the shuttle drone, which our leading scholar on the Baroque musette, the Belgian Jean-Pierre van Hees, calls a bourdon monoxyle, meaning a drone in a single piece of wood. So rather than having a separate wooden pipe for each drone note, as the Scottish and Irish bagpipes do, the musette has around a dozen parallel bores drilled through a cylindrical billet of wood or ivory, which are joined at their ends. You can see that on the right-hand side. They're plugged up and joined at their ends to form several continuous pipes, each furnished with its own double reed, as you can see in the bottom left there. If you stretch out the longest bore that's coiled up within this tiny little pipe, 15 centimetres long, the drone is 15 centimetres long, and the little bore goes around 6 times. So if you stretch it out, it's 90 centimetres long, which is sort of the string length of a cello or the length of a bassoon. And it's able to play a G at the bottom of the bass clef. So although this tiny little drone is only the size of a toilet roll, it's able to play, you know, as low as a cello or a bassoon. The musette's actually got a range of 3 octaves, amazingly. Uniquely, the musette's also got cylindrical bores throughout in both its drone and its chanters, and each has its own double reed, which gives this instrument a really unique sound. To our modern ears, it's not unlike a Nokia ringtone or a Nintendo game. But in the 18th century, there was really nothing else like it. It was a completely unique sound, which you'll hear tonight if you come to our concert. The first evidence we have for the musette is in 1551. On the left-hand side here, we can see Claude Paradin's book of heraldic devices. And it shows here pastoral items, a shepherd's crook or houlette, and shepherd's pipes, which have been interpreted here in the form of a musette with its shuttle drone. The German Michael Pretorius depicts the musette in his very famous De Organographia from 1620, which you see on the right-hand side, in which he describes, he says, in France, a little bagpipe, or Hummelchen, which is the name of a small indoor bagpipe, has been constructed into which air is pumped by means of a small bellows operated by one arm. It's interesting that Pretorius mentions it. You know, he's clearly not very familiar with the instrument because the musette just never took root outside France. And even within France, the musette was strongly linked to the royal court and to the aristocracy. This was never a folk bagpipe. It was a bagpipe for the highest echelons of society. So here we can see in this painting from 1580, a ball at Henri III's court, and the courtiers are dancing to music being provided in the top left-hand corner by 2 musettes and 2 shawms, the same instruments we saw depicted in Paradin's heraldic devices in the previous slide. So very much a royal bagpipe, not for the likes of us. From around 1660, the musette was actually given an upgrade by the Ottetaire family, which Mark mentioned earlier, who were a family of woodwind makers. And the Ottetaires were responsible for completely deconstructing Renaissance woodwind instruments and reinventing them in the form of the new Baroque woodwinds. So they developed the Baroque flute, which we see here and we saw in Mark's slide earlier, from its cylindrical Renaissance ancestor. They developed the Baroque recorder as we know it from primary school students, from its Renaissance ancestor. The Baroque oboe was reinvented from the shawm, and the Baroque bassoon completely reinvented from the kirtle, its Renaissance ancestor. So the Ottetaire family were credited, or Martin Ottetaire in particular, was credited with adding keys and double holes to the Renaissance musette's unkeyed chanter, which you see on the left, making the instrument fully chromatic. And also he's credited with the addition of a teardrop-shaped chanter riding on the side of the main chanter. You can see that on the right-hand side. And this little tiny, what's called a petit chalumeau, the little chanter, extended the range of the musette upwards by a fifth. So let's go to the next. This is a cartoon by the designer Laborde, which was for a tapestry. And it's very difficult to see, but this tapestry actually depicts both the ancient single chanted unkeyed form of the musette on the right-hand side here, up there, and over on the left, sorry for the people viewing at home, we can see the newly invented keyed two-chanted musette there. It's the only depiction we have of both those instruments side by side, and this tapestry is dated 1664. Now, these modifications made by the Ottetaire family made it possible for the musette to play art music, in inverted commas, such as suites and trio sonatas with basso continuo. It enabled the musette to keep up with the Baroque flute, the recorder, the oboe, to play art music, not merely folk music. And uniquely, the Baroque musette's double chanters allowed the instrument to play two melodies at once. So the musette is actually the only instrument which can double stop. And here we can see a piece by Jacques Martin Ottetaire, and you can see that it's got two separate lines for the musette to play there. Now, the following decade, after the invention of this new art musette, if you like, this double-chanted model made its first royal appearance in Jean Garnier's portrait of Louis XIV as the protector of arts and sciences in 1672. You can see that there, it's a bit dark, sorry, but there are instruments representing the arts. And to the right-hand side of Louis XIV in that central cartouche is a double-chanted musette, the only wind instrument depicted. Louis XIV was not the only royal to have his portrait painted with a musette. The miniature on the left-hand side here depicts Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, who was the regent of France prior to Louis XV's majority, playing possibly the same instrument that was depicted in the previous portrait. It's got several features in common with it. Now, question for Mark. The miniature on the right is in the Louvre, and it's presumed to depict a certain historical figure. So, Mark, who do you think it might be? Putting you on the spot now. No, I'm just interested to see, without feeding you any further information, who you think it might be. Bingo. So it's actually presumed to be Madame Pompadour. Yeah. So Louis XV's famous mistress, of course. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But at the Louvre, they say presumed to be Madame de Pompadour. By the second quarter of the 18th century, during the reign of Louis XV, the musette had become desperately fashionable amongst the aristocracy. It was an absolute craze. At this time, the fashion for all things pastoral could arguably be said to be at its zenith. And fabulously wealthy courtiers like nothing better than to cosplay at being simple shepherds and simple shepherdesses inhabiting the fields of Arcadia, where flowers sprang in endless bloom amongst their innocent flocks of sheep. I've never experienced the season of winter. So here we can see a fête champêtre genre painting by Lancret, and you can see rich people doing simple things in very, very nice clothing indeed, theatrical clothing. And in the centre of the painting, you can see a musette player providing the music for their dancing. So in these fêtes champêtre genre paintings by people like Watteau, Lancret, Boucher, And we see parties of rich people dressed together in theatrical clothing, dancing around classical ruins in deserted forest groves without a care in the world, often to the strains of a musette. If you look carefully in these paintings, you will frequently see a musette. You can see one on the right-hand side there on this painting by Watteau, and the chalk study for that painting as well. Now, portraits of aristocrats themselves began to reflect a longing for this pastoral idyll. Dressed in simple shepherd's garb of lustrous silk and damask, with their hound at their feet, purebred, of course, with their houlette or shepherd's crook to one side with a lovely satin bow around it. All that was needed to complete the illusion of an uncomplicated, rustic life was a simple shepherd's bagpipe, the instrument of choice for shepherds. Only this shepherd's bagpipe was far from simple. Made from ivory and ebony, harvested by slaves in France's African colonies, with keywork of silver, mined in lethal working conditions, covered with silk velvet and embroidered with silver and gold lace trim, handmade by destitute girls by candlelight without the warmth of a fire next to them, lest a coal be spat out of the fire and ruin their expensive work. All of this was designed to match the owner's finery. This musette here even has the owner, Gaspard de Guédon, has his family crest in silver on it. Nice little bit of metalwork for you there, Robert. So the musette was truly an instrument created through the suffering of the 99% for the amusement of the 1%. But don't cancel the musette just yet, because this charming instrument really can give us an insight into a sound world which no longer exists, as you'll hear later at our concert. The musette hovered on the border between a real musical instrument, able to play real music, and a fancy accessory or trinket for the uber rich. Owning a musette was actually a shibboleth through which its owner could signal their wealth and good taste to their peers and demonstrate that, yes, I'm part of this whole Arcadian pastoral lifestyle too, nonchalance and insouciance. So it really became a shibboleth for the rich. So aristocrats such as these queued up to have their portrait painted playing their musette. These days we can all take 50 selfies on our phone, and we can delete the 49 of the selfies where they, oh, sorry, this is taking, there we go. We can delete the 49 selfies where we don't look hot. But in those days, in the 18th centuries, you might only have had your portrait painted once or twice in your entire life. And so the fact that you wanted it painted playing your tiny bijou bagpipe gives you a really good idea of how fetishised this instrument was. We have so many portraits of aristos playing musettes. Not only men, but also women enjoyed playing the musette, which was seen as the only woodwind instrument fit for women to play because it's bellows blown. And so a lady didn't have to shove it unprepossessingly in her gob and blow to fill the bag. So it was seen as a very ladylike woodwind instrument to play because, frankly, nobody likes to see a lady playing an oboe. Right. Oh, there's another lady playing an oboe and a musette and a fete champetre. Oh, nobody needs to see a lady with a face screwed up like that. Now, as a precious fetishised object, the musette frequently appears in still life paintings by artists such as Vuillaume, Chardin, de Bertry, Vallayer-Costet, de Laporte, Oudry, the list goes on. And it's often depicted in conjunction with other musical instruments, particularly in allegorical pieces to do with music or sound or the sense of hearing or the air. Musettes can be a little difficult to spot when they're deflated because they just look like, a bit of drapery or a cushion with a recorder sticking out one end. But once you get your eye in, you'll find that they're actually everywhere in 18th century still life paintings and decorative arts. By the way, Mark, Mark again, Mark showed that very famous portrait with the gents with the flute and pointed out that one of the flutes was thought to have an extra hole for a while, which turned out to be a piece of fly poo. It's the same with this bassoon in this Berthy painting here. It's got what looks like a hole there just above the B flat key, but it later got cleaned off and realised that it was nothing. We all got really excited. What's the extra hole on the bassoon for? Now, what else can I say? Oh, yes, musettes appear also not only in still life paintings, but in decorative arts as well, such as these carved trophées in the interiors of royal palaces. The one on the right-hand side, in fact, is in Louis XV's private apartments at Versailles. Now, owning a musette was one thing, but learning how to play it was another. And a whole industry grew up around musette culture. 2 treatises on how to play the musette have come down to us today. One by Bourgeon de Sellerie on the left-hand side there, and you can see that that was published in 1672. And the one on the right-hand side by Jacques Martin Hotteterre, who was the gentleman playing the flute in the engraving, which Mark showed us earlier. Not only treatises, but an enormous quantity of repertoire for the musette survives. Musette duos, musette and basso continuo, trio sonatas for musette and basso continuo. And these were produced by composers such as Jacques Martin Hotteterre again, by Boismortier, by Corrette, the Chedeville brothers, who were scions of a musette making and playing family. In fact, the Chedevilles in the 18th century pretty much had the scene sewn up. You can see here on the left-hand side the title page for a collection of music for musette or hurdy-gurdy, vielle à roue, which is the posh version of a hurdy-gurdy, and basso continuo. And depicted on the frontispiece there, you can see 2 gentlemen playing musettes together and 2 ladies playing vielles à roue, hurdy-gurdies together. Sorry, one lady has a hurdy-gurdy and one lady has a musette. So these were very fashionable activities to do. And I had to show you, I love this piece here because it's called the Little Country Love Affairs of Mr. Rickard. During the late reign of Louis XV, with dictatorial Lully now long gone, and the absolutist monarch Louis XIV, and his dictatorial superintendent of music Lully now gone, the French public, I should say, were exposed to Italian Baroque music for the first time. By and large, they liked it, or at least they were fascinated by it, and they wanted to try it themselves. And even the musette was dragooned into this new fascination. So this is the title page and first page of Le Printemps by Chedeville, the musette maker and player. Does anyone recognise the tune for the musette here of Le Printemps? Anyone heard it before? It's Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So this was, even Vivaldi's Four Seasons was set for musette. It gives you an idea of how much people loved this instrument. Erin mentioned yesterday that the chanson was seen as a purely French genre, whereas instrumental music smelled a little bit of Italy, I believe was the term. And this, if nothing, this really reeks of Italy, doesn't it? It sounds like a pasta advertisement. That's from 1739, by the way. And perhaps in this, the seeds of the musette's demise were sown. The new musical languages which were gaining popularity in France, not only the Italian Baroque style that we see here, but hot on its heels, the newly emerging classical style of young Mozart, were not necessarily kind idioms for the rather limited musette to play in. In 1767, Diderot and D'Alembert devoted an entire plate to depicting this important musical instrument in their encyclopedia, showing us the internal construction of a musette with all of its reeds and so forth. But eventually the familiarity breeds contempt, right? And so the musette and its stringed cousin, the hurdy-gurdy, the vielle à roue, became so ubiquitous that people began to despise them. And we can see that here. This is really interesting. On the left-hand side, we can see a design for a bronze monument, which was never actually realised, from the reign of Louis XIV. The bronze was to glorify the great poets and musicians of the day and their glorious patron, of course, Louis XIV. So it depicts the road up Mount Parnassus, and the road you can see on the left-hand side there is lined with great poets, Quinault, Corneille, Molière, and with Lully himself, all crowned in laurels. The three graces are dancing amongst them at the centre there. They're overseen by the god Apollo, who's come to the earth, funnily enough, in the form of Louis XIV himself. And at the very top of Parnassus there, we see Pegasus, the winged horse, whose divine hoof created Hippocrene, the muse's magical spring, whose waters brought forth poetic inspiration in anyone who partook of them. The parody on the right-hand side here says down the bottom there, the new lyric Parnassus. Ignorance or bad taste rules everything in this age. And in this version, the road to the peak of Parnassus is populated with hurdy-gurdy and musette players and organ grinders. We can see in the centre here, there is a composer wearing a dunce's hat. So here we can see hurdy-gurdy players and musette players. Here's an organ grinder. And over here, there's an organ grinder loading her instrument up with a cat, which is clearly how you make an organ work. You stick a cat in a box. And then, of course, what have we got here? They're overseen by ignorance here with her ass's ears and her blindfold. And at the top of the whole thing, not Pegasus the winged horse, but a donkey having a wee. Charming. Now, even the fictional name, actually, there's one last little dig at the musette here. Sorry, I will finish very soon, which is even the names of the painter and sculptor of this, this plate are a dig. So you can see here the painter is called C Sol Ut and the sculptor is G Re Sol, C major and G major, the two keys that the musette are able to be played in. Now, in 1768, how am I going for time? Actually, I'm massively over time, sorry. In 1768, the Mercure de France advertised a new and improved musette. Sieur Luzzi, instrument maker, has found a way to perfect the musette and give it the sound of a clarinet and the human voice, and to make it docile to the taste of the performer. One can imitate on it the vivacity and clarity of tonguing of the transverse flute or the oboe, execute lively and detached strokes, and terminate final notes with a precise cut-off. This musette can be played with or without drone at will. Probably an instrument similar to this, which I won't go into now for reasons of time. Arguably, however, what this advertisement represented was an act of desperation. Just like the Venetian swell on English harpsichords from the 1760s, perhaps these improvements to the musette were a last-ditch attempt to render it suitable for the new musical languages gaining popularity at the time. It was no longer enough for the musette to do one thing. It had to sound like a clarinet. It had to efface itself by shutting off its own drones. But, you know, this glorified folk instrument with no dynamic range, which can only play in C major and G major, was never going to keep up with the requirements of the emerging classical musical language. So, you know, maybe by the time Laborde depicted the instrument and mentioned it in the song here in the Choix de Chansons, perhaps the musette had become a meaningless convention of pastoral symbology rather than a real instrument anybody actually cared to play. In 1780, it was Laborde himself who made the momentous pronouncement, "This instrument is absolutely no longer in usage." And we've got no evidence to contradict him after this point. Because, of course, what came next was social upheaval. And just a few years later, anyone who might still have entertained any interest in playing the musette or reviving it had their blocks knocked off. Laborde himself, indeed, was guillotined in 1794, and I like to think it's punishment for saying nasty things about the musette. So the trajectory of this instrument saw a massive crescendo in the second and third quarters of the 18th century in terms of popularity, in terms of repertoire and social cachet, and then suddenly gone, extinct practically overnight. The sudden demise of an instrument that was such a core part of French musical culture illustrates what a paradigm shift French music underwent in the 2 decades leading up to the Revolution. The sudden disappearance of an instrument built on the misery of the 99% for the amusement of the 1% is perhaps a really strong omen of what was to ensue. But, and this is my last point, I included these for you, Mark, other Mark. You know, echoes of the fetishized musette and the culture surrounding it reverberated for the next 150 years in visual arts, echoing Mark's remarks yesterday about the ongoing career of the Choix de Chansons as an object of bibliophilic desire. Musettes themselves, made of ivory, made of silver and silk, became precious objets d'art, symbolic of the glory days of the Ancien Regime, for which reason I'm happy to say about 150, oh, there's another 19th century picture of a musette. I should have mentioned that these are all from the 19th century. But we're lucky in a way because it means that 150 original musettes from the 18th century have come down to us today, which allows people like me to help reconstruct the sound world of Laborde's Choix de Chansons, which you will hear tonight. Thank you very much.